There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, like a Tuesday night, or a simple question asked in a quiet room. They were the camouflage of the mundane, and only in retrospect do you see them for what they were. The subtle shifting of tectonic plates, the silent redirection of a river that has flowed one way for 1,000 years. The before and after are separated by a breath, a word, a choice so small you barely register making it. For me, that moment smelled of stop bath and fixer, the acidic tang of chemicals that always clung to my clothes and settled in my hair. It was the smell of my art, my quiet place, the small, windowless bathroom I had converted into a darkroom. And it was the moment my best friend, my roommate, the unwavering, sunbright center of my universe, Noah, asked me to teach him how to be loved. He didn't phrase it that way, of course. His question was much stranger, much simpler, and infinitely more terrifying. He had found me in the red-lit gloom, a place he rarely ventured. The crimson safe light turned the familiar landscape of our shared apartment bathroom into something Martian and strange, bleaching the color from his tin skin and leaving him a sculpture of shadow and light. I was agitating a tray of developer, watching an image of a winter bear tree slowly ghost into existence on a sheet of photographic paper, my mind lost in the patient alchemy of the process. He didn't speak at first, just leaned against the doorframe, his broad shoulders filling the space, creating a sudden and profound sense of enclosure. The silence in the darkroom was usually a comfort, a thick, insulating blanket. With him there, it became a live wire, humming with a voltage I couldn't decipher. He was a creature of sound and light and motion. His stillness was always a sign that a storm was gathering somewhere deep inside him. I knew, without turning around, that this was the stillness that followed a cataclysm. I had heard him come home an hour earlier. There was none of the usual noise, no thud of a gym bag dropped by the door, no burst of music from the living room speaker, no cheerful, booming, "Liam, you home," that always managed to find me no matter where I was in the apartment. There was only the quiet click of the lock, the soft sigh of the door closing, and then a silence so absolute it felt like a tangible presence. I had stayed in my crimson sanctuary, giving him the space I assumed he needed, my heart a dull, anxious metronome against my ribs. I knew he and Sarah had been fighting. I knew it in the way his laughter had become more brittle over the past few months, the way his phone calls became clipped, hushed conversations in his bedroom with the door closed. Noah, who had never believed in closed doors. He was a person who lived his life in the open, an architectural marvel of glass walls and sunlit rooms, and the recent drawing of shades had been a sign of a deep, structural unhappiness. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, as if he'd scraped it over gravel. She left me. I stopped agitating the tray. The ghost of the tree on the paper continued to darken, unbothered by the sudden fracture in our world. I used the tongs to move the print to the stop bath, the chemical sting a sharp, grounding sensation. I didn't have to ask who she was. Sarah had been a fixture for 3 years, a part of our landscape, a presence at our dinner table, a variable in the equation of our friendship. I had always harbored a quiet, complicated knot of feelings about her, gratitude for the happiness she brought Noah, and a low, humming jealousy so profound it felt like a part of my own DNA. It was a secret, shameful thing I never examined too closely, like a dark spot on a lung scan you pretend you never saw. "I'm sorry, man," I said, my voice feeling inadequate, a tiny paper boat in the face of his tidal wave of grief. I turned to face him, wiping my damp hands on my jeans. In the dim red light, I couldn't see the color of his eyes, only the glint of moisture in them. He looked hollowed out, a building after a fire, the sturdy framework still standing but everything soft and familiar within it turned to ash. He gave a short, mirthless laugh that sounded more like a cough. "Yeah, me too." He pushed himself off the doorframe and took a hesitant step into the room, looking around at the hanging strips of negatives, the trays of liquid, the enlarger that stood like a strange robotic sentinel in the corner. "It's weird in here," he murmured, not as a judgment, but as a simple observation. It was a world entirely separate from his, a world of patience and shadow, the antithesis of his life lived at full speed under the brightest lights. "It's quiet," I offered. "Too quiet," he countered, then seemed to regret it. "No, that's not right. It's peaceful. I get why you hide in here. I wasn't hiding. I was creating. But I understood what he meant. This room was a buffer against the noise of the world, and right now, the world was screaming at him. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I had seen him make 1,000 times, before a soccer game, during a stressful exam, in the middle of a difficult conversation. It was his tell, the physical manifestation of his mind trying to sort through a tangled mess. She said a lot of things. He began, his gaze fixed on the print now sitting in the fixer, its image stark and permanent. That I was distant, that I wasn't trying, that it felt like I was performing, like I was going through the motions of what a boyfriend should be. He shook his head, a slow, bewildered motion. I thought I was a good boyfriend. I stayed silent. It was not my place to agree or disagree, only to listen. This was my primary role in our friendship. The anchor, the quiet harbor where he could moor his boat, no matter how battered it was by the storm. I was the keeper of his confessions, the vault for his fears. It was a role I cherished, a role I had perfected, even as it slowly, quietly broke my heart every single day. Because the one confession I wanted to hear, he didn't even know he had, and the one I wanted to make, I would never allow myself to speak. He looked at me then, a directness in his gaze that was so intense it felt like a physical touch. The dim red light seemed to coalesce in his eyes, turning them into twin embers of desperation. She said I didn't know how to be intimate. That I was a bad kisser. He said the last words with a kind of stunned disbelief, as if it were the most bizarre, incomprehensible accusation in the world. For Noah, who had always navigated the world with such physical confidence and easy charm, this was a critique that struck at the very core of his identity. It was like telling a bird it didn't know how to fly. That's ridiculous, Noah, I said, the words automatic, the knee-jerk defense of a loyal friend. Is it? He shot back, his voice sharp with self-doubt. How would you know? You've never seen me kiss her. Maybe I am. Maybe I've been doing it wrong this whole time. Maybe it's like I learned the wrong form for a free kick, and I've just been reinforcing a bad habit for years. He was grasping for an analogy he could understand, a sports metaphor for the inexplicable failure of his heart. It was so quintessentially Noah that a wave of tenderness washed over me, so potent it almost buckled my knees. I rinsed the print and hung it up to dry, my movements slow and deliberate, a way to anchor myself. I don't think it works like that. But what if it does? He took another step closer, and the small room shrank to the size of a confessional booth. The air grew thick with the smell of chemicals and his own unique scent, a mix of the clean laundry detergent we used and the faint, woodsy smell of his soap. It was a scent that, for me, was synonymous with home, with safety, with a constant, low-grade ache of impossible longing. What if it's something you can learn? Something you can practice? My heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat. It felt like the moments before a race, that breathless, electric anticipation where every muscle is coiled tight. I had a sudden, terrifying premonition of where this was going, a glimpse of a path opening up in front of me that was both a dream and a nightmare. I tried to steer us away from it, to guide him back to the safer, more familiar shores of platonic comfort. Noah, you're just upset. You're spiraling. It's not about how you kiss. Then what is it about? He pleaded, and his voice cracked on the last word. Because I need something to fix, Liam. I need something tangible. I can't just float. I need a thing, a task, something I can work on and get better at. Otherwise, I'm just broken, and I don't know how to fix being broken. And there it was, the core of him. Noah the doer, the builder, the problem solver. He couldn't stand the ambiguity of emotional pain. He needed a project. And in his grief-stricken, desperate state, he had decided that his project was learning how to kiss. A dangerous, foolish, beautiful project. He looked at me, his eyes wide and earnest in the strange, bloody light. The silence stretched, filled only by the drip of water from the freshly washed print onto the towel I'd laid on the floor. Every sane, self-protective instinct I possessed was screaming at me to say no, to laugh it off, to change the subject, to drag him out of the darkroom and into the living room and put on a stupid movie, to do anything but what he was about to ask. But I didn't. I just waited. Liam, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, a conspiratorial, desperate sound. You know things. You see things. You're quiet, and you pay attention. You understand the things I don't. He was building a pedestal for me, crowning me the quiet observer, the keeper of secrets. He was mythologizing my introversion, turning my quiet longing into some kind of perceptive wisdom. He had no idea how wrong he was. I didn't see things better. I just saw him, in excruciating, heartbreaking detail. Then came the question, the one that hung in the air like a developing photograph, slowly resolving from a vague shape into something sharp and clear and devastating. Will you teach me? My breath hitched. The world tilted on its axis. It was the most absurd request I had ever heard. It was a plea born of heartbreak and a fundamental misunderstanding of how human connection worked. It was a landmine disguised as a lifeline. And every single cell in my body, every atom of my being that had been silently, secretly in love with him for 7 years, screamed one single, treacherous word. Yes. I didn't say it aloud. I couldn't. The word was trapped in my throat, a butterfly with wings of glass. I just stood there, mute, caught in the crimson-tinted tractor beam of his gaze, my carefully constructed world of safe, unspoken friendship beginning to crack and splinter at the foundations. He had just handed me a match and a stick of dynamite, and asked me to show him how to light the fuse, completely oblivious to the fact that we were both standing in the heart of the life I had built, a life that was about to be blown to smithereens. The shift had begun weeks before the breakup, a subtle change in atmospheric pressure that I was perhaps the only one calibrated to detect. Noah's relationship with Sarah had been, from my perspective, a long, slow erosion. It wasn't a sudden earthquake, but the patient work of water on stone, wearing away the connection until its foundation was unstable. He'd stopped talking about their future, a topic that had once been a common feature of our late-night conversations. The casual, when we get a house, had been replaced by a conspicuous silence. He spent more time at home, in our apartment, finding excuses to work on a project in the living room while I edited photos, or insisting we cook dinner together instead of his usual habit of eating at Sarah's place 2 or 3 nights a week. He was, I realized in retrospect, withdrawing. He was pulling his ships back into a familiar harbor before the hurricane made landfall. I was that harbor. Our friendship was the solid ground he was seeking as his other world turned to water. The change was most apparent in his need for proximity. Noah had always been a tactile person, free with shoulder bumps and quick, one-armed hugs. But this was different. This was a gravitational pull. He would sit on the couch while I was reading, his leg pressed against mine, not in a flirtatious way, but in a way that felt like a child huddling close to a parent in the dark, a simple, primal need for contact to confirm he wasn't alone. He was anchoring himself to me. His loneliness was a palpable thing, a third presence in our apartment. It was a low-frequency hum that vibrated beneath the surface of our normal routines. It was there in the way he would linger in the kitchen while I made my morning coffee, talking about nothing of consequence, just delaying the moment he would have to leave for work and face the silence of his own thoughts. It was there in the flood of texts I'd received during the day, memes, links to articles, random questions, a constant stream of contact, a digital lifeline thrown across the city to make sure the connection was still live. I saw it all as a symptom of his failing relationship, the desperate flailing of a man who knew he was about to be adrift. My role, as always, was to be the steady point on the horizon. I absorbed his restlessness. I answered his texts. I let my leg be his anchor on the couch. I did not, for one moment, allow myself to interpret it as anything more than the desperate act of a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. And I was the driftwood. The breakup, when it finally happened, was not the explosion I had braced for, but an implosion. He collapsed inward. The vibrant, confident energy that was his signature power source simply switched off. He moved through our apartment like a ghost, his usual boisterous presence replaced by a heavy, defeated silence. He'd sit on the couch for hours, scrolling aimlessly through his phone or just staring at the blank television screen, the vibrant city lights reflecting in his vacant eyes. He was lost, not just in his grief for the end of a relationship, but in the terrifying new landscape of his own perceived failures. Sarah's parting words had become his new gospel, a litany of his inadequacies that he chanted to himself in the quiet hours. It was in this state of profound internal crisis that he came to me in the darkroom. He was looking for a way back to himself, a way to rebuild what he thought he had lost. His logic was flawed, born of panic, but it was also painfully sincere. He didn't want to learn how to kiss to impress some new, hypothetical girl. He wanted to learn because he believed it was a skill he lacked, a fundamental piece of the human connection puzzle that he had somehow missed. He believed that if he could fix this one, tangible thing, he could begin to fix the larger, more terrifying brokenness inside him. He was approaching intimacy like a software bug, a flaw in his code that could be patched with the right instruction set. And he had decided that I, the quiet observer, the one who supposedly understood the things he didn't, was the only one who could write the code. He trusted me. That was the most devastating part. He trusted me so completely, so implicitly, that he couldn't see the inherent danger in what he was asking. He couldn't see that for me. It wouldn't be a lesson. It would be a confession. And so, the ritual began. It did not start that night in the darkroom. I had managed to deflect, to mumble something about him being exhausted and not thinking straight, guiding him out of the red gloom and into the living room. I made him tea, something I knew he hated but wouldn't refuse, and I sat with him until the sky began to pale with the first light of dawn, listening to him talk in circles about Sarah, about his job, about everything and nothing. I thought I had dodged the bullet. I thought that in the clear light of day, he would realize the absurdity of his request, and we would never speak of it again. I was wrong. 3 nights later, he brought it up again. We were on the couch, watching some mindless action movie. The hero was kissing the girl after a particularly explosive car chase. Noah muted the television. The sudden silence was deafening. "See," he said, gesturing at the screen. "I don't do that." "Do what? Cause a 10-car pileup and then make out with a stranger?" I tried to keep my tone light, a gentle ribbing between friends. "No," he said, completely serious. He rewinded the scene and played it again in slow motion. The way he holds her head. It's certain. And the way he hesitates for just a second before. Like he's asking a question and she's answering it. It's a conversation. I stared at him. He had dissected a cheesy, cliched movie kiss with the focus of a film theorist, but he wasn't analyzing the artifice. He was studying it like an instruction manual. He was seeing a language he didn't believe he knew how to speak. "You're overthinking this, Noah." "Am I?" He turned to face me, his expression earnest and open. "Or have I been underthinking it my whole life?" "Liam, I'm serious. I wasn't just talking nonsense the other night. I need this. Please." The word please was my undoing. It was quiet, stripped of all bravado. It was the sound of my strongest friend admitting he was lost and asking for a map. And I was the only one he would ask. To refuse would be a cruelty I wasn't capable of. It would be a betrayal of the very foundation of our friendship. And so, against every instinct for self-preservation, I heard myself say the words that would change everything. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay, Noah." The first lesson was a monument to awkwardness. We sat on the couch, the television off, the only light coming from a single lamp in the corner, casting long shadows across the room. The air was thick with a tension so profound it felt like we were underwater. He was looking at me expectantly, like a student on his first day of class. I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in my chest, and I had to swallow it down. This was insane. "So what do I do?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. I have no idea." I stammered, feeling like a complete fraud. "This is a terrible idea." "No, it's not. Just tell me what I do wrong." "I don't know what you do wrong. I've never, you know." He sighed, a puff of frustration. "Okay, forget what I do wrong. Just show me what's right." Show him. He wanted me to show him. I felt my entire body flush with heat. My mind was a frantic scramble of pros and cons, of hope and terror. This was a line. Once it was crossed, there was no going back. But he was looking at me with such desperate, trusting eyes. He wasn't seeing me, Liam, his friend who had been quietly in love with him for years. He was seeing a teacher, a guide. He had created a role for me to play, and in doing so, he had given me a shield, a costume. I could do this if I was just playing the part. It wasn't me kissing him. It was the teacher. "Okay," I said again, my voice barely audible. The thing you said. About the movie. The hesitation. That's part of it. It's not an attack. It's a question." I leaned in slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I watched his eyes, trying to read them. They were wide, focused, pupils dilated in the dim light. I hesitated, just as I described, a breath away from his lips. This was the point of no return. I could still pull back, laugh it off, and our world would snap back into its old shape. But he didn't move. He just watched me, waiting. He was giving me permission. He was answering the question. So I closed the small distance between us. It was not a good kiss. It couldn't have been. It was chaste, brief, and technical. My lips pressed against his, and my entire nervous system lit up like a switchboard. I was hyper-aware of everything. The surprising softness of his mouth, the faint stubble on his jaw, the scent of his skin. I was also aware of my own rigid posture, the clinical nature of the contact. I was trying so hard to be instructive, to keep my own feelings locked away, that the act itself was sterile. I pulled back after a few seconds, my face burning. "See," I said, my voice strained. "It's slow." He was quiet, his eyes searching mine. I couldn't read his expression. It was a mixture of concentration and something else, something deeper I couldn't name. "Okay," he said softly. "My turn." He mirrored my movements, leaning in slowly. I held my breath. His focus was absolute. He was a student determined to master a new skill. He kissed me, and it was a careful, deliberate imitation of what I had just done. It was hesitant, gentle, and brief. And it was utterly devastating. Because even in his attempt to be clinical, there was an inherent warmth to him, an unconscious tenderness that he couldn't suppress. It was in the way his hand came up to rest on my shoulder, a grounding, instinctive gesture. He pulled back. Was that better? Better than what? I asked, my voice hoarse. Than what I normally do, I guess. I don't know what you normally do, I repeated, feeling dizzy. Right? He looked down at his hands, then back at me. Okay, again. And so it began. The ritual. 2 or 3 nights a week. After the day had been put to bed and the city outside our window had quieted to a hum, we would sit on the couch and practice. The pretense of instruction was my shield. I would offer absurdly analytical advice. Less pressure, try to breathe. It's not a race. I became a connoisseur of the mechanics of something that should never be mechanical. I broke it down into its component parts, deconstructing the magic in a desperate attempt to protect myself from it. But the ritual began to evolve. The lessons grew longer. The initial awkwardness was replaced by a quiet, dangerous familiarity. My clinical instructions started to fade away, replaced by a silent, shared understanding. We no longer needed to talk about it. One of us would simply catch the other's eye, a silent question asked and answered, and we would lean into each other. The kisses themselves changed, too. They deepened. They slowed down. They were no longer chaste, technical exercises. They became explorations. His hand would move from my shoulder to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair. My hand would find his waist, pulling him infinitesimally closer. I lived in a state of constant, heightened awareness, a paradoxical blend of euphoria and terror. Every moment we spent together was charged with this new, unspoken current. I analyzed every touch, every glance, every shared silence, searching for meaning, for a sign that this had become for him what it had always been for me. My internal monologue was a relentless storm of hope and fear. Was this still practice? Was he thinking of Sarah? Or was he, impossibly, thinking of me? I was walking a tightrope over a canyon, and the view was breathtaking, but I knew that at any moment, a single gust of wind, a single misstep, could send me plummeting. The couch became a sacred, terrifying space. It was our laboratory, our sanctuary, our confessional. We never spoke of what we were doing with anyone. It was a secret world we had built for ourselves, existing only in the dim lamplight of our living room. To the outside world, we were just Liam and Noah, roommates and best friends. But in that bubble, we were something else entirely, something I didn't have a name for. He seemed to be getting better, not just at kissing, but in general. The hollowed-out look in his eyes was slowly being replaced by something else. The heavy silence that had clung to him began to lift. He was still grieving his relationship, but he was no longer lost. It seemed his strange, misguided project was working. He was fixing himself. But with every lesson, with every soft, lingering kiss, a terrifying question grew louder in my mind. What would happen when he decided he was fixed? What happens when the student no longer needs the teacher? The thought was a shard of ice in my chest. I was teaching him a language he would one day use to speak to someone else. I was healing his heart so that he could give it away again. And I was doing it willingly, because it was the only way I knew how to have him, even if it was just for a little while, even if it wasn't real. Or maybe, just maybe, it was. That hope was the most dangerous thing of all. The crossing happened on a rainy Thursday night in October. The weather had turned, stripping the trees of their leaves and lashing the city with a cold, persistent drizzle. It was the kind of night that encouraged staying in, of drawing the curtains and pretending the outside world didn't exist. We had ordered pizza and were sprawled on the couch, a comfortable, familiar silence between us as we watched the rain streak down the window panes. Noah had been quiet all evening, but it was a different kind of quiet than the heavy, grief-stricken version I had grown accustomed to. This was a thoughtful, pensive silence, and it made me more nervous than his sadness ever had. He seemed to be on the cusp of something, a decision or a realization, and I felt a primal urge to keep him right where he was, in this safe, ambiguous space we had created. After a while, he put his phone down and turned to me. The lamplight caught the side of his face, illuminating the sharp line of his jaw and the earnest curve of his mouth. "Can we practice?" he asked. The question had become our code, the key to our secret world. But tonight, it sounded different. The usual pretext of a lesson felt thin, almost transparent. It sounded more like a simple request for closeness. I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He shifted on the couch, turning his body to face me fully. He didn't lean in right away. He just looked at me, his gaze so direct and searching that I felt stripped bare, as if he could see past the carefully constructed walls of my friendship and into the chaotic, yearning mess of my heart. His eyes, a warm hazel that could shift from green to brown depending on the light, seemed to hold a universe of unspoken thoughts. He was looking at me not as a student looks at a teacher, not as a friend looks at a friend, but as a man looks at something else, something he is trying to understand. His hand came up, but instead of resting on my shoulder as it usually did, his fingers gently traced the line of my jaw, his thumb brushing against my lower lip. The touch was electric, a spark that shot through my entire body. It was an impossibly tender gesture, an act of such deliberate intimacy that it shattered the fragile pretense of our lessons. This was not practice. This was not a mechanical exercise. This was something real. My breath caught. I should have pulled away. I should have made a joke, broken the spell, retreated to the safety of our established roles. My mind was screaming at me, a cacophony of warnings about the impending devastation, the inevitable heartbreak. But my body, my heart, they refused to listen. For 7 years, I had lived on scraps of affection, on the ambient warmth of his friendship. And now, he was offering me something more, something real, and I was too starved to refuse the feast, even if I knew it was poisoned. He leaned in, and this time there was no hesitation, no analytical slowness. It was a movement of pure, magnetic pull, as if we were two celestial bodies finally succumbing to a gravitational force that had been acting on us for years. His lips met mine, and it was like nothing that had come before. All the previous kisses, our entire ritual of practice, felt like faded black and white photographs compared to this. This was vibrant, living color. It was slow and deep and breathtakingly gentle. It was not a question, it was an answer. It was a confession made without words. He kissed me like he was trying to memorize the feel of my mouth. He kissed me like he had been thirsty for 1,000 years, and I was the first drop of rain. And I kissed him back with all the pent-up, unspoken longing of my silent love. I let the walls crumble, let the carefully guarded secrets of my heart flood into the space between us. My hand came up to cradle the back of his head, my fingers tangling in his soft hair, holding him there, willing this moment to stretch into an eternity. It was a kiss that held years of conversation, years of shared laughter and quiet comfort, years of my secret adoration and his unknowing grace. When he finally, slowly, pulled away, he didn't go far. He rested his forehead against mine, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. His eyes were closed. I could feel the slight tremor in his hand, which was now resting on my chest, right over my wildly beating heart. The silence that followed was not awkward or tense. It was profound. It was the kind of silence that follows a revelation, a quiet, awestruck space where the world recalibrates itself. He let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of weeks of confusion and grief. "Okay," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't decipher. He said it again, softer this time. "Okay." It was the same word he had used after our first, clumsy, technical kiss. But the meaning had been utterly transformed. It was no longer the acknowledgement of a student. It was the sound of a man surrendering. It was the sound of arrival. In that moment, lying awake in my bed long after Noah had retreated to his own room with a quiet, dazed good night, the past came rushing back not as a memory, but as a necessary context, a map to explain how we had arrived at this impossible, terrifying, beautiful precipice. I finally understood that to comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened on the couch, I had to trace the entire architecture of our friendship from the very first brick laid. We had met as freshmen in college, the random hand of the housing department making us roommates. I remembered seeing him for the first time, a whirlwind of sun-bleached hair and confident energy, hauling a massive duffel bag with a soccer ball tucked under his arm. He was all bright smiles and easy introductions, shaking my hand with a firm grip and immediately starting to unpack, filling the sterile, cinder-block room with the noise and color of his life. I was his opposite in every way, quiet, reserved, carrying a box of camera equipment and another of books. I had prepared myself for a year of polite but distant coexistence with a stranger. I had not prepared myself for Noah. He had refused to let me be distant. He saw my quietness not as a wall to keep him out, but as a door to be opened gently. He would ask about my photographs, not with polite disinterest, but with genuine curiosity, picking up prints and asking me to explain the light, the composition, the feeling I was trying to capture. He'd drag me out of our room to eat in the dining hall, introducing me to his ever-expanding circle of friends, always with a proud, "This is Liam. He's a genius. He makes art." He appointed himself my defender, my social ambassador, creating a space for me in a world I would have otherwise observed from the periphery. Our friendship was forged in the crucible of late-night study sessions fueled by terrible coffee, in the shared stress of exams, and in the easy comfort of watching movies on a tiny laptop screen. He was the one who encouraged me to submit my photos to the student art show. I was the one who stayed up with him all night when his parents announced they were getting a divorce, not offering advice, just sitting with him in the dark, a silent, steady presence until the sun came up. We learned each other's rhythms, the cadences of each other's joys and sorrows. He was the steady beat of a drum, and I was the quiet melody that played over it. The love I felt for him didn't arrive in a single, blinding flash. It was a slow dawn, a gradual realization that crept over me so subtly I didn't recognize it for what it was until it was already a permanent part of my internal landscape. It was in the way my stomach would flip when he'd throw an arm around my shoulders after a game. It was in the ache I felt when he'd talk about a girl he liked. It was in the simple, profound peace I felt just being in the same room with him, the world feeling safer, more coherent, when he was near. I accepted it as a fact of my life, like my eye color or my height. It was a love that was destined to be unrequited, and I made my peace with that. His friendship was too valuable to risk on the impossible chance that he might feel the same. He was straight. It was a simple, immutable fact. So I built a fortress around my heart, a place where the love could live, contained and managed. I became an expert at hiding in plain sight, at pouring all of my affection into the acceptable channels of friendship. I was his biggest supporter, his most loyal confidant, his quiet harbor. And I was content with that role, because the alternative, a life without him in it, was unimaginable. When we graduated and decided to get an apartment together, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. He was starting a demanding job as a software consultant, and I was trying to make a living as a freelance photographer. We were two constants in a world of variables. He met Sarah a year later. I remember the day he told me about her. He was practically vibrating with excitement. That sun-bright energy of his turned up to its highest setting. And I smiled, and I told him I was happy for him, and every word of it was true, and every word of it was a lie. The fortress around my heart held, but I could feel the tremors in its foundation. For 3 years, I watched him love her. I welcomed her into our home. I learned to appreciate her for the happiness she brought him. I relegated myself to the role of the supportive best friend, the third wheel, the permanent fixture in the background of their life together. And the ache in my chest became a dull, chronic condition, something I learned to live with, like a phantom limb that would throb on cold nights. So when he had come to me, broken and lost after she left him, my first instinct was pure, unadulterated friendship. But when he made his impossible request, a tiny, treacherous seed of hope, a seed I thought I had buried years ago, began to germinate in the darkness. The ritual of our lessons became a secret garden where I allowed that hope to grow, watering it with every stolen kiss, every shared silence, every lingering touch. I told myself it was just a fantasy, a temporary indulgence before the inevitable return to reality. But tonight, that kiss on the couch, that wasn't a fantasy. That was real. It was a crack in the foundation of the world as I knew it. He had crossed a line he wasn't even supposed to know existed. And as I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, the euphoria of that moment began to curdle into a profound and terrifying anxiety. He had surrendered to something, yes. But what if he didn't understand what he was surrendering to? What if this was just another stage of his grief, a misguided attempt to find comfort in the most convenient place possible? I had let him in. I had let down all my defenses for that one perfect kiss. And I had the sickening feeling that I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. I had risked the most important relationship I had for a moment of impossible beauty, and now I had to face the dawn and the possibility that it had all been a beautiful, devastating illusion. The morning after was a study in absence. I woke to the sound of silence, a specific kind of quiet that meant I was alone in the apartment. The air in the living room was still and heavy, haunted by the ghost of last night's intimacy. A single coffee mug, not his usual one, sat on the counter, a sign that he had been up and gone before I had even stirred. There was no note, no text message, just a gaping void where his presence should have been. The comfortable, lived-in space of our home suddenly felt vast and empty, like a museum after closing hours. A cold dread began to seep into my bones, chilling me more than the autumn air outside. This was not our routine. Noah was not an early riser unless he had a flight to catch, and he would have told me. This silence was intentional. It was a retreat. It was the sound of a man running from something he couldn't face. My heart, which had been soaring only hours before, plummeted. He was scared, and his fear felt like my guilt. I had taken advantage of his vulnerability. I had let my own selfish desires override my duty as his friend. I had read hope into a moment of confusion, and now he was recoiling from the consequences. The days that followed were a quiet, agonizing torture. He was a ghost in our home. He'd leave before I was awake and come back long after I had gone to bed. When our paths did cross, in a brief, unavoidable moment in the hallway or the kitchen, he would avoid my eyes, offering a clipped, "Hey," before disappearing into his room and closing the door. The closed door was the most painful part. For years, he had lived with his bedroom door perpetually ajar, an unspoken invitation, a symbol of his open nature. Now it was shut, a solid, wooden barrier between us, a definitive statement of his withdrawal. My texts to him went from casual check-ins to increasingly desperate pleas. "Everything okay?" I'd write, only to be met with hours of silence before a curt, "Yeah, busy at work," would appear. The vibrant, constant stream of communication that had been our lifeline was now a dry riverbed. The silence in the apartment grew louder every day, filled with all the things we weren't saying. The couch where it had all happened felt like a crime scene I couldn't bring myself to approach. I was adrift, lost in a sea of my own anxious projections. I replayed that kiss over and over in my mind, searching for the moment I went wrong, the point where I had misinterpreted the signals. Had I imagined the tenderness? Had I invented the surrender in his eyes? The pain of his absence was a physical thing, a hollow ache in my chest that made it hard to breathe. It was worse than the years of quiet, unrequited love. That had been a manageable pain, a chronic condition I had learned to live with. This was acute, a fresh wound that refused to close. I had been given a glimpse of a world I had only ever dreamed of, and then had the door slammed shut in my face. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, and underneath the hurt, a slow, simmering anger began to build. Anger at myself for being so foolish, and a frustrated, helpless anger at him for being so cowardly. He had initiated this. He had asked the question. He had leaned in first. And now he was leaving me alone to deal with the wreckage. After a week of this agonizing silence, I couldn't take it anymore. The not knowing was eating me alive. I needed a confrontation. I needed an ending, even a painful one, to this limbo he had trapped us in. That night, I didn't go to bed. I sat on the couch, the one place I had been avoiding, and I waited. I turned off all the lights except for the one lamp, recreating the scene of our last real conversation, our last real connection. I was setting a stage, forcing a final act. He came home just after midnight. I heard his key in the lock, the soft click of the door. He stepped inside and stopped dead when he saw me sitting there in the dim light. His shoulders slumped, the posture of a man who had been caught after a long chase. He didn't say anything, just stood by the door, his briefcase hanging from his hand like a dead weight. "We need to talk, Noah," I said, my voice quiet but firm, betraying none of the frantic anxiety that was churning inside me. He let out a long, weary sigh and finally moved, dropping his bag and shrugging off his coat. He didn't come to the couch. He leaned against the kitchen counter, putting a physical island between us. "Liam, I'm exhausted." "So am I," I retorted, a bit more sharply than I intended. "I'm exhausted of this. Of you hiding from me in our own home. Of you acting like I don't exist. What are you so afraid of?" He ran a hand through his hair, that familiar tell. He wouldn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on the floor, on the window, on anywhere but my face. "It's complicated, is it?" I stood up, my own frustration making me bold. "It didn't seem so complicated last Thursday. It seemed pretty simple, actually." He flinched, as if I had struck him. "Don't," he whispered. "Please." "Don't what?" "Don't talk about it. We have to talk about it, Noah. You can't kiss me like that, and then disappear. You don't get to do that." My voice was rising, trembling with a week's worth of hurt and confusion. What was that? Was it just more practice? Was I just a convenient, warm body for you to work out your issues on? Is that all I am to you? No. The word exploded out of him, sharp and wounded. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a desperate, panicked conflict. It was the look of a man trapped in a burning building, not knowing which way to run. "Of course not. You know that's not what you are to me." "Then what am I?" "What was that kiss?" "Because it wasn't a lesson." "I know it wasn't. And I think you know it, too." He finally broke. He pushed himself off the counter and began to pace the small space between the kitchen and the living room, a caged animal. "I don't know what it was, okay? I don't know. I'm so confused, Liam. My whole life just fell apart. Sarah left, and she said all these things that made me feel like I was fundamentally broken. And I came to you because you're the one person who always makes sense. You're my anchor. You're the one who fixes things." "I'm not a thing to be fixed, Noah," I said softly, the anger draining out of me, replaced by a profound sadness. "I know," he said, his voice cracking. He stopped pacing and faced me, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I know that. But that's how it started. It was a project. It was something I could control. But then it wasn't. The lines got blurry. And that night, that last night, it wasn't about practice. It wasn't about Sarah. It was just you." He said the word "you," as if it were a revelation that terrified him. "It felt right," he continued, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. "It felt more real than anything I felt with Sarah for the last year. And that scares the hell out of me, Liam. Because what does that mean? What does that make me? My whole life, I've been one thing. And now, I don't know what I am. And I looked at you, and I felt that, and I just panicked. I ran, because it was easier to run than to face what it all meant." His confession hung in the air between us, honest and raw and painful. He had finally admitted it. It wasn't just me. He had felt it too. The terror I had seen in his eyes was not revulsion. It was the fear of the unknown, the fear of a man whose compass had suddenly, inexplicably, started pointing in a new direction. He hadn't been running from me. He had been running from himself. And in that moment, all my anger, all my hurt, dissolved, replaced by a wave of overwhelming, heartbreaking empathy. He was just as lost as I was. We were both just standing in the wreckage, trying to figure out which way was up. The silence that settled after his confession was different. It was not the tense, screaming void of the past week. It was a fragile, trembling space, the quiet after a storm has passed, leaving a landscape that is both shattered and cleansed. He stood there, looking at me, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. He had laid his fear and confusion bare, a vulnerable, tangled offering. The next move was mine. I could have retreated back into the safety of my own hurt, demanded more, pushed for labels and definitions he was clearly not ready for. The old me, the self-protective, quiet observer, would have done just that. He would have built his walls back up, brick by painful brick. But the kiss on the couch had changed me too. It had cracked open a part of me I had kept locked away for years, and I couldn't, or wouldn't, seal it back up. He had been brave enough to be a mess in front of me. I had to be brave enough to meet him there. I walked across the room, closing the distance he had put between us, and I stopped just in front of him. I didn't touch him. I just stood there, letting him see the truth in my eyes, letting him see that I wasn't going to run. It was never practice for me, Noah, I said, my voice so quiet it was almost a thought. Not once. His eyes welled up, the unshed tears making them glisten in the lamplight. A single tear escaped and traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. I know, he whispered. I think I've always known. I just wasn't ready to see it. That was it. That was the admission that unraveled everything. He had always known. On some subconscious level, beneath the layers of their easy friendship and his own self-perception, he had felt the pull. He had felt the quiet, steady hum of my love and had mistaken it for the simple comfort of friendship. The lessons had not created something new. They had simply given a name and a physical form to something that had been there all along. He wasn't changing. He was finally recognizing what was already true. You don't have to know what you are, I said, my voice gentle. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. We can just be. We can be confused together. He let out a shaky laugh that was half a sob. I don't know how to do that. Sure you do, I said, and I finally allowed myself to touch him. I reached out and gently wiped the tear from his cheek with my thumb. His skin was warm. He leaned into my touch, a small, involuntary movement, his eyes fluttering closed. We just stop running. We stay. We just stay. He opened his eyes, and the panic was gone. In its place was a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, but also a sliver of something else. Relief. The profound, soul-deep relief of a man who has finally stopped fighting a current that was pulling him home. Okay, he whispered. The word was not a surrender this time, nor an acknowledgement. It was a promise. It was the beginning. He didn't kiss me then. The moment was too fragile for that. Instead, he just reached out and pulled me into a hug. He wrapped his arms around me and held on tight, burying his face in my shoulder. And I held him back, my arms circling his strong back, my face pressed into his neck. It was not a hug between friends. It was the embrace of two survivors clinging to each other after a shipwreck, finding solid ground in one another. We stood there for a long time, in the quiet of our living room, just breathing each other in, the silence no longer empty, but full of a new, unspoken understanding. The foundation of our world had been shattered, but here, in the rubble, we were beginning to build something new, something honest. The new normal did not arrive with a thunderclap or a grand declaration. It tiptoed in, soft and unassuming, in the quiet moments of the days that followed. It was a new kind of silence, one that was not empty or tense, but filled with a comfortable, settled certainty. We were learning a new language, or rather, we were finally allowing ourselves to speak the one we had both known, on some level, all along. It was a language of small gestures, of quiet intimacy that needed no pretext. The morning after our confrontation, I woke to the smell of coffee. Not the bitter, burn offering I usually made for myself, but the good stuff, the kind Noah liked. I walked into the kitchen to find him there, wearing a soft gray t-shirt and sleep pants, his hair a mess. He was pouring 2 mugs, not one. He looked up when I entered and gave me a small, hesitant smile. It was a smile that reached his eyes for the first time in weeks. Morning, he said softly. Morning, I replied, my heart doing a slow, happy flip in my chest. He slid one of the mugs across the counter to me. Our fingers brushed. The small, accidental touch sent a jolt of warmth through me. But this time, there was no anxiety attached to it, no frantic internal analysis. It was just nice. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he leaned over the counter and pressed a soft, slow kiss to my lips. It was a simple, chaste kiss, a good morning kiss, a kiss that said, this is real. This is us now. And then he pulled back and took a sip of his coffee, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And I realized, with a sudden, breathtaking clarity, that it was. The closed door to his bedroom opened again. But now, it wasn't an invitation for me to come to him. It was just a door, left open because there were no longer any barriers between us. He didn't need to retreat to his own space, because his space was now our space. More often than not, he didn't even end up in his own bed. The ritual of the couch evolved into something new. We'd still end up there at the end of the day, but there was no more practice. We would just fall into each other, his head in my lap as I read, or my legs tangled with his as we watched a movie. The physical contact was a constant, easy presence, as natural and necessary as breathing. The kisses were no longer lessons. They were conversations. They were a quick, laughing press of lips in the middle of a story. They were a long, slow, deep exploration on the couch in the dim light, born not of a need to learn, but of a simple desire to be close. They were a tender brush of a mouth against my forehead when he thought I was asleep. Each one was a sentence in our new story. I'm here. I'm not running. I choose this. I choose you. We didn't talk about labels. We didn't try to define what we were. There was no need. The words felt clumsy and inadequate compared to the simple, solid reality of our new existence. We were Liam and Noah. We lived together. We made each other coffee. We slept in the same bed, his arm draped around my waist, my back pressed against his chest, a perfect, puzzle piece fit. We were just us, and it was more than enough. One afternoon, a few weeks later, I was in my darkroom, developing a new set of photos. They were different from my old work. The stark, lonely landscapes and empty rooms were gone. These were photos of small, intimate details. The way the morning light hit the rumpled sheets on our bed, the pattern of Noah's laughter lines around his eyes, his hand resting on a coffee mug. My art was no longer about observing a world I felt separate from. It was about capturing the beauty of a world I was finally a part of. The door opened, and he leaned against the frame, just as he had on that first, fateful night. The red light painted him in the same dramatic shades, but he was no longer a hollowed-out sculpture of grief. He was solid and calm, and he was smiling. "What you working on?" he asked, his voice a low, happy rumble. "Just some stuff," I said, smiling back at him as I agitated a tray. He came into the room and wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. He smelled like clean laundry and coffee and home. He watched the image slowly appear on the paper. It was a close-up shot of his hand, resting on my knee, taken on the couch a few nights before. "You see things," he murmured against my ear, echoing the words he had said to me that first night, but their meaning was transformed. It was no longer a plea for instruction. It was a statement of quiet awe. "You really see things." I turned my head and kissed him, a slow, sure kiss amidst the smell of chemicals and the dim red light. It was a kiss that held no questions, only answers. It was the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, a silence that was no longer about what was unspoken, but about what no longer needed to be said. We had started with a strange and foolish question, a clumsy attempt to mend a broken heart. We had navigated the terrifying, exhilarating landscape of unspoken feelings and profound vulnerability. And in the end, we hadn't just fixed what was broken. We had built something far more beautiful in its place. We had found our way not to a new normal, but simply, finally, to normal.